I appreciate being invited to be part of this conversation, this celebration of my colleague Mwenda's 2010 reverse gaze. I met Mwenda perhaps when he was still at the University of Illinois, where I am now as a graduate student, but he was about to achieve that milestone of becoming a PhD. And we began our conversations about anthropology and anthropologists, anthropologies at that time. So I appreciate that you've invited me to be part of this conversation. And I must tell you, Mwenda, I really appreciate that in your book, you seriously engage my work, Outsider Within, which was published 2 years before yours came out. I think in so many ways, we're on the same wavelength. And it's very heartening for me, who in 1993 decided after serving a term as president of the ABA that I needed to go global, all right, in order to really find ways to pursue and implement a praxis as an anthropologist in epistemological decolonization. And so I got involved with the IUAES, and in 1993, it doesn't take much time to figure out that at the what we used to call intercongresses and congresses, that there was a conspicuous underrepresentation, if not an absence, of African anthropologists, also anthropologists from global Africa. Very often, I was one of very few Black people. And that led me to develop a conviction about learning more about what my colleagues on the continent and in the global arena were doing, and finding ways to enlist their participation in an organization that claimed to be international, global, but very often was, unfortunately, found itself falling short of that because of these conspicuous absences, because of what UNESCO and the International Council of the Social Sciences in its 2010 report, World Report on Social Sciences, Knowledge Divides. It documented the epistemological and the institutional and structural disparities among the social sciences worldwide. And so that's where anthropology belongs, within that global context. And we, as well as sociology, political science, geography, on, have suffered from that knowledge divide, because we have been at the heart of what Boaventura Sousa Santos has characterized as the cognitive empire. We've been assigned in the global division of labor to study the other, the non-Western other, or the folk elements of the West. All right, but we have nativized those peoples and communities. We have objectified them as sources of raw materials or raw data. We have cheapened the intellectual labor that has been exercised in anthropological praxis of those communities by assigning Africans the task of being the objects of mining raw materials or being located in sites where cheap or cheapened labor, the labor of informants, but also the labor of professional anthropologists who very often have PhDs, but have been treated as though they are glorified field assistants. So this may sound almost stereotypic to many of you. You say, well, that's dated. That's the way it used to be. But I would say if you do a close reading of the writings, the accounts that Black anthropologists around the world have produced, also indigenous anthropologists and some other subaltern intellectuals, you see that things have not changed enough in 2020. And at this particular juncture, it's clear that all the fractures, the fractions, the contradictions in the social sciences and anthropology in our societies are quite conspicuous because of the impact of convergent crises, the pandemic, economic injustices, but also crises within what many of us are beginning to call racial capitalism. All right, the ugliest facets of this global racism, which Black anthropologists in Africa, Caribbean, and Latin America, and in the United States are using Achille Mbembe's notion of necropolitics to help us understand why so many of us have been existentially vulnerable to regimes of death. And I'm thinking intellectually, we're also vulnerable to what Santos refers to as epistemicide. And that killing may assume extreme forms, or they don't have to be extreme. You don't have to have a total eradication or erasure for death or social death or epistemic death to be at issue. But Mwenda made a courageous intervention by publishing his book. He exposed anthropology's place within the cognitive empire and showed that alternative approaches to doing anthropological work were possible. And he used the device of a reversal. And I have something to say about reversal. I think his book pushes us to think about, well, how can we reposition the anthropological gaze or gazes? Because reversal sort of is based on a notion, well, there's African and then there's Western or North Atlantic anthropologies. And so you reverse the gaze in order to expose the limitations of conventional anthropology, anthropological hegemony. But when we complicate notions of anthropology by mapping a much more multi-centric, multi-sided terrain involving anthropologies, we realize that perhaps reversal is not the best notion. Certainly repositioning, all right, rethinking the epistemic space, locations, relationalities, so that we can, as is often called for, we can decenter, provincialize, parochialize North Atlantic anthropology so that it's part of the conversation, but it is recognized as being an embodied partial perspective, as Donna Haraway puts it. And so we can discard with what she calls the God tricks, the sleights of hand, which assume that a Western, usually androcentric vantage point can perform the conceit of being disembodied and having access to omniscient or universal knowledge. You know, African gazes can provide the entry points into a knowledge that has global significance and implications, but within a context of what decolonial scholars call polyversality, rather than the conceits of universality, which a number of thinkers from the South have critiqued, including Sylvia Winter, for instance. The late Archie Mafeji who wrote against what he experienced and saw as epistemological apartheid. A South African anthropologist, of course, using an analogy that spoke to him in very visceral ways. But beyond the analogy, we can say that the way Black anthropologists have historically, and even today, despite our advances and the changes, the way we have been located and relegated to particular spaces, even when they are celebrity spaces, causes us to think critically and figure out perhaps new techniques or tactics of developing what are critically nuanced and multifocal lenses that enable us to build upon, but to transcend the potential limits of a notion of reversing the gaze, which suggests that you relegate the West to a type of peripheral zone and let them feel it emotionally and intellectually. And I think that may lead us to a cul-de-sac, but certainly to reposition and to find ways to share or disperse intellectual and institutional authority so that we can address the knowledge divides and the disparities that UNESCO has attested to, and some of us have known for a long time. So I commend you for celebrating reverse gaze, because if not a sacred text, is certainly a significant intervention that I think should be required readings for graduate students and for students who take upper division levels. And I'm happy to be in a network of colleagues who have assigned the book, and many students have been deeply affected by the book. The book has told them that they too can belong to anthropology, but an anthropology that has accepted the responsibility to undergo considerable democratization, decolonization, and remapping in terms of our understanding of what our relationship is to the world.